Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Friend Show. I am your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and I'm joined today by Mr. Bheki Mahlobo. Bheki, how are you doing?
Doing well, and yourself, Nick? How's it, Gabriel?
I am doing all right. It is that kind of weather where it doesn't feel like it can make up its mind as whether it wants to rain or scorch us all with the burning sun. Which is not my favorite weather, but we shall endure. And of course, we are also joined by the great bearded one, Mr. Gabriel Crouse, whose beard, I think, where are we on the beard level, Gabriel? I think we're about equal at the moment. Yours is a little bit better, I think.
No, yours is neater around the moustache, Nick. But we're not doing as well as we could do because Bheki is looking very clean.
Yeah, no,
we need to draw him into the messy side of life.
You're bringing the side down. Far too neat and clean shaven. Your hair should be a mess, and you should have a gross beard.
No, I would love to actually grow a beard. It's just that my genetics do not allow it. It's like this is all that I have, Gabriel, and it makes me quite sad.
That's the saddest thing I think I've heard all week.
On to happier news. The country's falling apart.
Country's falling apart. But what else is? That's not really news, right? I mean, that's like every day. But anyway, so what's the story today? Of course, part of the reason that we're broadcasting early for those who are watching live is, of course, we are still sitting with stage 4 load shedding. And last night, CEO of Eskom, Andre de Ruyter, played a bit of defense. He gave an analysis of what exactly was going wrong with Eskom. So, with all of the recent load shedding, there's been lots and lots of bad news about de Ruyter. Some journalists asked him whether he was "quote unquote" sabotaging the South African economy. The National Union of Mine Workers has called for the resignation of de Ruyter and the Eskom board. The Black Management Forum. The Black Management Forum has also called for him to resign. And last night he was playing defense. He said, look, I'm not going willingly. If I get fired by the minister, then that's one thing, but I'm not just going to step down because some people said so. He laid out all of the really big problems with Eskom. He said that not a single megawatt had been added to the grid since the stage 6 disaster recently. He said that there was a shortage of technical skills with Eskom. He said that contractors were performing really bad work, and that was causing some of these breakdowns because the repairs that were done were shoddy, and that he couldn't change this because the procurement requirements meant that they had to go with the lowest and cheapest tender every single time. And basically, he he didn't paint a very hopeful, optimistic picture of Eskom. Which I think in some ways is actually a bit refreshing because it is kind of laying out the bare facts of how bad the situation is, which is nice instead of sort of meaningless happy talk. He did say that asking him to resign was flogging the dead horse or changing the jockey. And the media, some genius in the media came up with the headline, no sense changing jockeys on a dead horse.
Yes, that is a great headline.
So let's start with, I don't know, Bheki, tell us a little bit about the generation problems, because you've been looking into some of the numbers and you've been watching Eskom pretty closely.
Unfortunately, Nick, what happens when you have corruption, cater deployment, a decade long of hostile policies, not willing to do much of allowing the private sector in, and just simply bailouts upon bailouts upon bailouts, and now green bailouts, you find yourself in the situation that we're in currently. A lot of analysts agree that the country needs more capacity in terms of electricity generation, and that could be done by simply signing by the hands of Gwede Mandashi. And unfortunately, over the last 10 years, we've seen a dramatic decline in the generation capacity of Eskom, from about 85% to its current levels at a low 60%. That's a massive drop. and an increase from 6% in 2011 to 30% in the unplanned outage factor. These are the proportion of breakdowns in the country in Eskom's power station. Unfortunately, that caps South African GDP to levels of about 1%. This is something that even the previous finance minister, Tito Mboweni, saw in the projected year of 2023, having a GDP of 6%. So it caps South African economic growth levels at level, and unfortunately leaves us behind to other countries, unfortunately, and declining living standards in the country.
It was quite interesting, some of the things Ruyter said about how they have to plan maintenance 2 years in advance, and that Eskom basically didn't have the cash to be able to do that. He said, for example, that one of the problems is that Treasury takes 77 days to respond to requests from Eskom as to approve money and that kind of thing. So, Gabriel, what do you make of what Ruyter said last night, and what do you think? What do you think about this?
Yeah, so I'm going to come in with Machiavelli again. Anyone who studied a little bit of political science at university or even heard about it will know there was this guy, Nicholas Machiavelli, who gave advice to the prince about how to dominate and command. And it sounds really scary, but there are actually some good ideas there that apply to business, to parastatal business, and to politics more broadly. And one of his key lessons was to spend your political capital early. It's very tempting when you take over a position to think that, well, right now I've just come in, so let me spend a couple of years making friends with everyone and showing that I'm legit, and then I'm going to start fighting back. It just turns out, and there's good data to sort of support this over the years across various fields, that it's much better to come out swinging, because when you've just been appointed, that's when you're most likely to be popular. And here's the point. There are some decisions that need to be made that are unpopular amongst a small minority for an intense period of time, but that are very popular amongst most people for a longer period of time. So Eskom reform is a key example of that. Eskom was hugely overstaffed. According to its own chairperson back in 2019, at least 33% overstaffed. So it had staffing issues that it had to deal with. If you try and cut down excess staff, just as an example, you're going to have 10,000 people that are very irritated with you for a few months, but you're going to have 60 million people that are really happy with you for a few years, because that's going to free up extra resources that you can then use to keep up maintenance and efficientize your process. So staffing is not the biggest issue at Eskom at all, but that's an example of it. Now, my problem with Ruyter has always been that he wasn't the other Andy, which is Andy Carlitz, who is the most successful South African and one of the most successful people from anywhere in the planet in terms of utilities and the power sector. He was a Shell, and he is now running the largest liquid natural gas project in North America. And he offered to step down from being one of the most powerful dudes in the world, getting one of the biggest salaries, to come and save Eskom. Everyone thought he would be the CEO, but Pravin Gordhan got someone who Carlitz was going to come out swinging right from the beginning. Ruyter has waited. Ruyter has spoken nicely. He's kind of walked slowly. When he was challenged after firing the CFO, basically, when he was accused of being a racist, he came on and said, "I'm not a racist." And he gave good answers there. And then he kept being asked. And then he said, "Look, I'm not a racist because I've got lots of black friends and I've promoted lots of black people." And then he sort of went through the list. That's not really a good way to show that you're not a racist, in my opinion. It's sort of like buying into the sort of BE logic. Anyway, the point is he's sort of being quite half and half. Now he's being very serious. Now he's no longer trying to do spin doctoring. He's no longer trying to paint an overly optimistic picture. He's speaking truth to power. Powerful lobbies that represent small minorities are coming after him, and he's saying, this is the state of play. This is what's in the national interest. These are the problems that we face. These are how long-standing the problems have been. This is what we're going to need to do to deal with it. And I'm not going to go unless I get fired. And if I get fired, it's going to be because, the board, I'm beholden to the board and the board is beholden to the minister. So, go shout at the minister. This is my argument. I think this is very good what he's doing. I also think that it would have been better if he'd done this when he was immediately appointed. We would have been in a position to go into the lockdown, which was terrible for the country, but could have been great for Eskom, because you had such reduced demand on the grid because of basically shutting down so much business, that could have been a time to really get some maintenance done, some refurbishment done, some cleanup done, some streamlining done, so that as South Africa looks to exit the pandemic and enter the end game of endemic COVID, we could have had that ceiling that Bheki described, which is the fundamental thing. Load shedding is irritating. The last few days, it's like hard for us to have our Zoom meetings. We have to shift around the daily friend show. There's lots of irritating stuff about it. But just zoom out, and what you see is a ceiling placed on South African growth of 1%. We need at least 5% for 5 years, really for a decade, in order to make a serious difference. Lifting that ceiling is the priority. And to do that is going to take knocking out vested interests who would rather have a larger section of a smaller pie than deal with an accountable and transparent economy that's growing, where they can only actually get a larger section if they're prepared to add value, rather than sort of threaten people with strikes and burn stuff down and so on.
Yeah, load shedding is kind of like the opposite of lubricant for the economy. It's sort of like a kind of sticky glue that just makes everything more difficult. Just hearing someone yesterday complaining about the enormous amount of traffic in Johannesburg when there's load shedding. And you think about that, that's actually a serious cost. If you have to spend 2 hours in traffic in what would normally take you 20 minutes, that's time lost working. It doesn't matter what you do.
Loss of productivity as well.
No, exactly. Anyway, Bheki, you have any final thoughts on this before we move on?
Nothing more to add to what Gabriel has mentioned. There are like a few more things that Ruyter has done good on in terms of increasing maintenance when you're looking at the generation capacity, as well as the debt reduction of Eskom. My concern is that the actions that needs to be taken, unfortunately, the Pravin Gordhan as well as Parliament will not allow him to take those actions. That's the main point of concern. And without those necessary actions that the country needs, unfortunately, we'll be capped at that level of just 1% GDP growth level.
Yeah. Sorry, just to make it clear, that's the point. The thing that's really happening now is that in a subtle but clear way, Ruyter is now taking the fight to Pravin Gordhan and to Parliament.
Yeah.
In the public square, he's saying, this is what we need. You guys need to come to the party. You guys are really the obstacle. And that's a very good development. This sort of negative messaging has a potential positive upside if that pressure can strike through.
Well, we wish him luck. I would rather like load shedding to end, within my lifetime. Anyway, tomorrow is, of course, I think the medium-term adjusted budget speech. Bheki can correct me if I'm wrong there, but it is the first budget speech going to be given by our new finance minister, Enoch Godongwana, who has replaced Tito Mboweni. Tito Mboweni decided that he much prefers cooking not great-looking meals on his farm rather than being the finance minister.
They look very good. They look fantastic.
No. They're made with a lot of love, Gabriel, but they don't look great. There's a difference.
Gabriel, I don't think Nick likes pilchard, actually, because
I don't like pilchards. That's the first. That's very true. Guilty as charged. Anyway, so Tito Mboweni gave up the fight. I think it was probably quite a miserable job, and now Enoch has the heavy burden of being the most credible person in government. And tomorrow we're going to see how he does that job. I presume he won't be there with the aloe plant like Tito will. But Bheki, what can we expect from Enoch's budget speech tomorrow?
What you can expect from Enoch, it's actually an update from the February budget speech. I was corrected by Davi Root, a good man. So it's largely an update by National Treasury as to where does the country stand in terms of its fiscus. What I expect that Enoch will touch on is the better than expected collection of revenue by the South African government. I've seen certain estimates that this will be about 130 to 160 billion above the February budget. That's largely due to the commodity rally that we've seen over the past 18 months. which has also led to a trade surplus. South Africa's exports are made up of commodities. So whenever we have a commodity rally, it leads to an appreciation in the rand, as well as an increase in government revenue collection when you're looking at levies and so forth. And what also happened is that we had an increase in business sentiment, largely due to the mining sector in the country. So I do expect that he will largely touch on that, as well as project better than expected economic growth, better than that of Tito Mboweni. But what's important here, Nick, is looking at the government expenditure levels as well as government revenue levels, which I expect expenditure levels to be above that of revenue levels, leading to a deficit level of about 6 to 5%. That's what I'm expecting from tomorrow's update by the National Treasury. And due to the rebasing done by Stats SA, South African debt levels will be lower than initially projected in February, which was about 80%. Now I'm seeing figures of about 70%. But what's most important, Nick, is the trajectory of debt levels, which is unfortunately going up. That's a major point of concern, because as the country increases its debt, the accumulation of debt, the risk of the country profile goes up. In other words, interest that the government needs to pay on new acquired debt goes up. Debt servicing costs rises. In fact, as we currently speak, as well as you'll see tomorrow, debt servicing cost is the second largest expenditure item after education. We spend more on paying on servicing debt than we do on paying on healthcare, as well as police and law and order in the country. That's a major risk that the country currently faces, that we're taking away resources from things that we actually need, such as healthcare, and we just we're paying it off by servicing our debt levels in the country.
So it sounds from what Bheki was saying there, Gabriel, that the picture is slightly better, I think, than we were expecting definitely last year with our economy. Were we right to be so concerned with the health of the economy? Are things turning around?
No. It's really important to remember the low base effect. So if you sort of shrink by 10% and then you grow by 10% off what you shrank, then, just imagine this with numbers. You're on 100, you go down 10%, you get to 90. Then you grow by 10%. Well, 10% of 90 is 9. So you're only getting to 99. It's not taking you back to where you were. Now, we are not going to grow by as much as we shrank. But even the amount that we grow by is off the low base. So it's worse. It's much worse than it seems. Now, there's a double basing issue, which comes from the fact that Treasury and Stats SA have rebased sort of what counts as a real rand from sort of 2010 values to 2020 values. And that's made the Ramaphosa pre-pandemic era look a little bit better. But it hasn't taken away the fact that in the Ramaphosa pre-pandemic era, we had negative gross fixed capital formation, which means real business was shrinking, and we had a recession. Okay, so South Africa went into the pandemic like a glider with no engine, sort of nosedive, not quite nosediving, but sort of descending into the rocks of hell. And the pandemic kind of gave us a bit of a nosedive. Our recovery is just like there's no engine behind it. It's just turning the nose back up, but staying on the overall trajectory of descent. And Bheki's hit the nail on the head in how that gets expressed. It gets expressed in a debt spiral where you've got so much debt that you end up spending all the new money that you make on repaying the debt. And that's still not covering the amount of debt. We're still running a primary deficit, which means you're adding to the debt, even though you're spending so much, even though the second biggest line item is interest payments, we're still accumulating more debt than we're paying off. And that means that it gets more and more expensive to pay off debt. Now, just to add a point that Bheki and I have discussed, if you look at So part of what's been good for South Africa is the commodity boom, but part of what's been good for South Africa is that the first world, I mean the US, but really Europe and central banks across the first world have invented a hell of a lot of money in order to pay for the cracks of lockdown. Now, if you are if you're sitting on the Africa desk at Goldman Sachs or Oliver Wyman or HSBC or whatever, you are looking at a very interesting situation where the German government, for example, will charge you to buy their bonds. I mean, that's not very attractive. Like, Come. Imagine if you went to your bank and they were like, guys, if you put your money in our bank, then we'll charge you. And we'll charge you more than like the interest we pay. We'll actually charge. That's not very delicious. South Africa will pay you 10%. So that's very risky. Why is the interest rate so high in South Africa? Because the risk is so high. But you're going to put some money, especially if you've suddenly got new, fresh money. So we're in an artificially good position right now in terms of the commodity boom and in terms of the, when I say artificial, partly because of what's happening in China, I don't think it's a sustainable boom, and really in an artificial position in terms of global first world monetary policy. As you see tapering, as you see the governments kind of rewind some of that invention of money, South Africa is just about the most traded sort of bond and currency markets in the emerging world. So we are the most exposed to those kinds of kickbacks, flashbacks, not kickback in a nice way. So that's not looking great. I just want to say one last thing about Enoch Godongwana. This is a nice example of the same point I try to make about the Machiavellian lesson in when to spend your political capital. Do it at the beginning. Right now, Enoch Godongwana is in a position to say the following. South Africa didn't just have a lost decade. It set itself up for another lost decade, because during that lost decade, we not only did the government steal a lot of money, it also borrowed so much money that is a major nightmare. Eskom has managed to pay down some of its debt, but that's still its biggest problem. The country at large is still so heavily indebted that we're facing a debt spiral. The only way that we get out of this is to limit the size of government, to basically reduce taxes, give a shot in the arm to the private industry, deregulate. The fiscus is not going to work. I, as the finance minister, am not going to be able to do my job of producing a stable budget unless the rest of you guys get your act together and tighten your belts. And when I say you guys, I'm not saying the private sector. I'm saying the public sector. You need to tighten your belt so that the private sector can find this place to be an attractive investment destination again. If he ever wanted to say something about expropriation without compensation being a threat to the fiscus, now would be the time to say it. That would make a huge difference. The NEC of the ANC does not get to write his medium-term budget speech. Neither does Luthuli House. This is by law. He gets to sign off on what gets said here. So he should say it. If he doesn't say it, he's not going to say it next time. And if he doesn't say it next time, then I think Bheki's exactly right. As things get worse, as the government fails to pay off grants and pension funds because the debt's getting so ridiculous, as Eskom gets further sort of swamped, as the tapering issues in the first world and a retreat in commodities hit us in the teeth, as we really get desperate, the loud clamoring for just taking stuff to fill the gap will be impossible to overwhelm from inside the ANC unless their so-called best chance at reform starts laying the groundwork for doing so now.
Right, and he's in the position that you described at the beginning, that he's just come in, so now he's got more political capital, and
just a point if I just may there, Nick, is that Enoch was a major proponent of prescribed assets last year, and my fear here is that if he does not mention what Gabriel touched on tomorrow in terms of actually looking at the real problems that this country faces, and actually is talking about the threats of EWC, talking about the reduction in public entities in terms of debt levels, then I fear that in future, a government's coffers will then begin to run dry. And what might he look at is prescribed assets. In other words, tapping into private pension funds in order to fund government infrastructure projects. And I think that's a huge risk, especially with now, as what Gabriel mentioned, of these central banks are mentioning tapering, are mentioning increasing interest rates. That would mean that servicing new debt in future in South Africa will become more expensive than what it is right now. And unfortunately, that's a huge risk that the country currently faces.
Right, so let's move on now to our last story, and that is Gabriel, you throughout COVID have been really looking into the pandemic, into some of the science of stuff, into what's going on in the medical establishment, all that kind of stuff. And you wanted to talk about a recent study done by Discovery Health in South Africa into the effectiveness of the COVID-19 vaccines effects, as well as natural immunity. What did you have to say about this?
Yeah. let's just remember, I don't like the word immunity, because when people hear immunity, they think, oh, I can never get it, I can never get sick, I can never die. There really is no such thing. There's just protection. So there's vaccine protection and there's convalescent protection, which you get when you get it and then you recover. What Discovery has tried to do is use its membership base to basically dig through the numbers and figure out how effective have vaccines been at protection, how effective has convalescence been at protection. And then in this latest little piece, I would not call this a study. I would call this like a bit of in-house research that they published, although it has been called a study by themselves, to see if you combine vaccines with convalescence, what does that get you? Well, that clearly gets you the best. They've got no one on record who caught COVID, recovered, got vaccinated, and then died. That number's 0. In terms of people who caught COVID, recovered, and didn't get vaccinated, they have found a small number of deaths. Now, if you look at the article on Politics Web, you can see that they've got 11 deaths out of 4,000 people who caught COVID a second time within 3 months. 0 deaths for people who caught COVID and then got reinfected between 3 months and half a year. Though they had 6,500, nearly 7,000 people who caught COVID twice, 0 of them died. They have 20,000 people who caught COVID and then more than half a year later caught COVID again. 20,000 people out of their 1.5 million membership were in that position. 14 of them died. So that's 14 out of 20,000. That's a case fatality ratio of less than 0.1%. 0.1% is about, and a case fatality ratio is confirmed cases, deaths over confirmed cases. In every study I've seen across the board, case fatality ratios are 10 times higher than infection fatality ratios because we're missing a lot of infections or not getting tested. So that implies an infection fatality ratio of 0.01%, which would mean on their data, if you've caught COVID and survive 3 months, in fact, if you've caught COVID, your odds of dying again are like 10 times less than your odds of dying of the flu or any other cold. So that's good news, but it gets even better if you also get vaccinated. It comes down to 0. They have sneakily not published the death numbers for vaccination, although an earlier piece implied that the vaccination death numbers were higher than the convalescent death numbers, but they haven't offered a like-for-like comparison. They haven't offered an age-adjusted comparison, which is pretty weak because, as we know, COVID is orders of magnitude more likely to kill someone who's in their 60s than it is to harm us on this call. And so for us, it might very well be that they've got no one below the age of 60 who caught COVID twice and died. But they just haven't released the numbers, so we don't know. I'll be chasing them down for those numbers, as I did before at the start of the year. I chased them down for their sort of estimates of how many people have caught COVID in the first place. And eventually that's become kind of a mainstream talking point because they released those numbers. I think the look, let me just flag one thing. If you check out this article on Politics Web, which is just their press statement, like the numbers don't add up. They literally have, as I said, 11 deaths out of 4,000 tests for people who caught it twice quickly, 0 deaths for people who caught it within half a year, 14 deaths out of 20,000 confirmed cases for people who caught it twice over half a year gap, but then 3,000 deaths as the total, which is just not what 11 plus 14 is. So that's like a huge anomaly in their data. And it's not really surprising to see such a weird mistake, in the same way that it wasn't really surprising to see the IEC sort of publish a ward in which 200 people were registered, but 5,000 voted for the ANC. You know, it's like a mistake, but is it a surprising mistake? Not to me. Anyway, they will fix it because I will ask them to, I'm sure. But the overall point is that it looks like, you know, if you've caught it and you're a Discovery member, then your odds of catching it again and dying are really less than 1 in 10,000, which given that this is a deadly pandemic is pretty great. On top of that, we've had the lowest case and death numbers on record. On top of that, even Professor Crisp, who is more on the sort of COVID alarmist side of things, has said if you're worrying about a spike in cases and deaths coming out of the election, you should remember that the election was not the scary thing. It was like campaigns before the election. And if you look at the average time it takes for those spikes to appear, we would probably already be seeing them appear. Now, that's not to say we're out of the woods. We'll keep a close eye on the numbers, but it's looking really good. So again, South Africa just is clearly in a very good space right now in terms of COVID. It's not a state of disaster. If you want to end the Command Council, I'm head of campaigns for disbanding the Command Council and ending the state of disaster, and then bringing it back if we need to, but really ending it now for sure. And if you want to support that campaign, we've got over 10,000 subscribers. Go to ir.org.za and you can add your voice to that.
Awesome stuff. Apologies, Bheki, but we are out of time, so I won't be able to come to you now. But thank you very much for listening. Please like and subscribe, leave us good reviews, all that good stuff, and support the Institute of Race Relations. You can SMS your name to 32823 and we'll call you back. Anyway, thank you very much and have a wonderful day, everyone. We'll see you tomorrow.